Are you overwhelmed by the challenge of personalizing communication for thousands of students? That's where Element 451's AI assistants come in. From nudging prospective students to guiding those already on their journey, AI assistants don't just automate, they write, build, and optimize every step of your digital campaigns. Discover how at element451.com/AI team.
Hit it! That's what I'm talking about.
Wait! Okay, now, from the beginning.
Hit it, boys.
Welcome to Reclaiming Free Speech, Democracy, and Discourse on Campus, a podcast about the post-2024 election America look. I'm Dr. J. Cody Nielsen, Assistant Professor of Higher Education at Western Michigan University and Executive Director of Convergence Strategies. No matter the outcome, the 2024 election will set the stage for the next decade of higher education. In this Pulse Check series, I'll interview policymakers and practitioners to discuss their outlook on higher education, the ways in which we might reestablish higher education's public trust, and what a post-2024 election will look like on college campuses. From expression of speech to civil democracy and discourse, America's higher education system is at a dramatic turning point, and we're here to break it all down. Let's dive into today's episode. Welcome to Reclaiming Free Speech, Democracy, and Discourse on Campus, a post-2024 election America. I'm Dr. J. Cody Nielsen, Assistant Professor of Higher Education Leadership at Western Michigan University and Executive Director of Convergence Strategies. No matter the outcome, the 2024 election will set the stage for the next decade of higher education. In this Pulse Check series, I'll interview policymakers and practitioners to discuss their outlook on higher education, the ways in which we might reestablish education's public trust, and what a 2024 election will look like on and off campus. From expression of speech to civil democracy and discourse, America's higher education system is at a dramatic turning point, and we're here to break it down. Let's dive into today's episode. Today's guest is Ashley Rodgers Berner, Director of the Johns Hopkins Institute for Education Policy and Associate Professor of Education. Dr. Berner's work includes Pluralism and American Public Education, No One Way to School, published in 2017, and new book, Educational Pluralism and American Democracy, How to Handle Indoctrination, Promote Exposure, and Rebuild America's Schools, published in April of 2024. Dr. Berner, thank you and welcome to the podcast. Glad to have you here.
It's a joy and an honor to be with you. Thank you so much for the invitation.
You know, Ashley, it's so great to connect with you, and you and I have been connecting for a couple of months now over some conversations that we've had. And this whole time we've been thinking about what's coming with the election. And here we are, the day after the election, not 24 hours after the election results, and actually in the last hour with Kamala Harris making her resignation speech to, or at least her consolation speech to Donald Trump and to the nation. I want to hear from you, and I think our audience will be best served if we heard a little bit more about your background and your story and your work. That sort of quick intro doesn't tell us a whole lot. So tell us how you ended up at Johns Hopkins and working on this, and more about the work of the center itself.
Well, sure. So my doctorate's actually not in education, it's in history. I studied intellectual history in the late 19th and early 20th century, and I actually used to teach at a large public university. I taught history, and what really struck me in that process, in that classroom, was just the lack of knowledge that my very bright, very worthy students came with. And, you know, they had not encountered rich philosophy or history or literature or any of that. And when I gave it to them, they were so enlivened. And I still have them writing me 25 years on. And I had to understand why this disparity happened and how we could fix it. And that's what kind of catapulted me into education policy. So through various ways, I ended up working with David Steiner, who was the commissioner of education in New York State, very involved with the Obama White House and the race to the top. And anyway, I ran a small institute with him at Hunter College, or CUNY Institute for Education Policy. And we were recruited 10 years ago to Johns Hopkins to create a nonpartisan, non-aligned, independent center to translate research into policy and practice. So our work at the Institute is really geared for helping policymakers, whether they are state leaders, district leaders. We are school sector agnostic, so we work with charter sector, Catholic schools, Jewish day schools, Montessori, all of the above, to help them improve what they offer to students in two respects. I would say most of our work boils down to helping with a strong knowledge building curriculum, which is a game changer for first generation kids, and strong distinctive school cultures. And I guess I should add, we are located at a tier 1 research university, but we work in the K-12 space. So we get to work with policymakers. We worked in almost every state in the country in some fashion, and work internationally with other scholars from other countries working on K-12.
This is really helpful, and it bears respect to think about the work you have done, and obviously that you and David began a decade ago in terms of this. One of the things I really want to talk about today around this is, so you mentioned the idea of sort of school culture as well as strong knowledge building. And as a historian, I sort of wonder, and I want to sort of lean right into the question, because this conversation is about sort of free speech and democracy and discourse and all of the pieces. Like, from what you see and what you're doing from this center and what you've seen in your former work as a historian in practice as a professor, like, what are the kind of necessary tools that we need to be giving to our students today to help them understand and effectively be equipped for going out in the world and knowing their history and knowing what they're seeing around them?
Yeah. So let me just give you one statistic. So according to the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which is the closest thing we have to like a national report card, the percentage of 12th graders in our country who are proficient in U.S. history, and proficient is kind of a low bar, percentages of those who are 12th graders about to launch into higher ed or career, 12% are proficient in U.S. history. I mean, I'm talking failure to launch here. So let's just back up and say, how could we change that? So political scientists look to 4 key measures of successful civic formation. The first is political knowledge, and that's not just knowledge about our branches of government, but properly speaking, knowledge of how other governments work, how monarchies work, how totalitarian dictatorships work. How about geography? Like, where is the Persian Gulf? Why is it important? Those kinds of things. So the political knowledge to make good citizenship decisions. Number 2, the political skills to, say, interpret a graph, or, write your congressperson, or, connect the dots between what happened last year and what happens this year in foreign policy. So those skills. The third is the capacity for civil tolerance. And civil tolerance does not mean anything goes or relativism. It means the capacity to hold your own strong viewpoint and to listen to, with respect, opposing beliefs. So that's the third. And the fourth is the habit of civic involvement and actually making a difference in your community. So those are the 4 capacities. All 4 of those are learned behaviors. We don't come from our mother's womb capable of listening to others with respect. We have to learn it. Now, our adult population has manifestly not learned this in the aggregate, right? You just look on social media for 5 minutes and you find really smart leaders demeaning others, like, in ways that you would never expect. And so our adults can't do this, but we have to slow ourselves down and give our teachers the tools and the confidence to help young people learn this. And it is possible. So I think those 4 learned measures, if we can lean into those and help our school systems say, we are going to be talking about a wide variety of viewpoints. We're going to be learning comparative religion and ethics. There's a huge difference between learning about something and learning that it is true. And that's the kind of distinction I make in my book about the difference between indoctrination and exposure. And our country confuses those.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that has become like a center point of the sort of anti-DEI conversations that we see, is that the perception by parents or perception by anti-DEI advocates that what we're doing is we're indoctrinating, not exposing people to knowledge and information about things.
Well, I think to be fair, we have to make sure, we're being honest about, let's be exposed to different understandings of the human experience. And what I do see, because our team reviews curricula all the time. We work with a lot of districts to review their curricula, their English and their social studies materials. And we find this real binary sometimes, that some systems are insistent to present like a very cheerful view of American history without the whole dark truth, right? On the other hand, we find sometimes the attempt to talk only about police brutality, enslavement, and incarceration and oppression. And actually, that too is not truthful, and it can be disempowering for young people. So, for example, we worked with Baltimore City, and we found that most of their materials that were about the African-American experience, even those that were about the Baltimore African-American experience, which is huge, it's right, it's really important. The vast majority of those resources were about police brutality, enslavement, and incarceration. They had very little from the Harlem Renaissance. They had nothing from Frederick Douglass. They had, there was nothing role modeling or hopeful or agency oriented. And when we told that to Dr. Santelises, she threw out the curriculum and adopted a more comprehensive, holistic curriculum and wrote about it in the Washington Post. So the balance between telling the truth and also not robbing young people of agency is something that we've got to take seriously in the process.
Do you feel like when you were a faculty member in history, or do you feel like in your role as a policymaker and director of a center now that is based in an R1 institution, do you find yourself under pressure to skew in one direction or another in terms of your teaching or your practice?
I don't. I mean, because part of it is we put a stake in the ground and said we are nonpartisan, we are non-aligned, we are about trying to help all young people have access to excellence. And so I will say it's a joy to be part of Johns Hopkins because our president, Daniels, really does believe in viewpoint diversity. He really, he's written a book on what universities owe democracy that is all about the sober mission that we have to engage the next generation with the important questions and the important knowledge. I guess I get up in the morning worrying about the kids who can't even apply to college, or who can't take credit-bearing courses at a community college without remediation. The inequities in our country are so vast, and that's what I get up in the morning trying to address.
Yeah. Let's lean a little bit more into this conversation around pluralism. You recently had a book come out in April of this year talking about educational pluralism and American democracy. And the subtext is how to handle indoctrination, promote exposure, and rebuild America's schools. When we throw the word pluralism around, I hear the word pluralism thrown around an awful lot. And I'm wondering if you can help us define what you mean by pluralism and maybe what the field of education means by pluralism.
It's a really good question. And I would say, pluralism writ large in our country would simply mean that we have a population that has very different views of the good society, of the meaning of life, of what makes life worth living, and that part of the point of a democracy is to enable all of those different ultimate claims to thrive and live together. But when I talk about educational pluralism, I'm really talking about the structure of public education. Is public education one thing or is it many? And so a pluralistic structure for education says, because education can't be neutral, we're going to fund all different kinds of schools. So most democracies actually fund, as part of the public education, they fund Jewish schools, Montessori schools, socialist schools, Waldorf schools, because it's important to have schools that reflect parents' different needs. It's not just about religion or philosophy, it's about pedagogy or focus. And so the Netherlands funds 36 different kinds of schools. That's what they mean by public education. The same in the UK, the same in Belgium, the same in Sweden, the same in many provinces of Canada and Australia and Indonesia and Israel. They fund a lot of different schools. In fact, more than 80% of the countries in the world have more of a pluralistic structure. So if you walked around in Netherlands and said, what's public education? They would answer it with, well, it's the Hindu school down the street, or it's the socialist school on the next corner, whatever. Our country has structured education in terms of public education equals the district school. And that's been part of our mindset for 100 plus years. It didn't used to be that way, but it has been. So part of my argument is that a pluralistic structure is one piece of a really healthy school system. And in US parlance, school choice is important. But the pluralism also has another edge to it, which is, sure, we will fund schools that have different ethos, but all of our students have to know the same content. We are going to hold some content in common. And this is really important. And I think in the post-election period, this is really important to remember that if all you do is give parents money to spend however they want to, you are risking that common knowledge building that is necessary for effective citizenship. The fact that we haven't done that part well in the US, like 12% proficient in US history is at 12th grade, we haven't done a good job, doesn't mean we should just jettison that goal. That's how we close achievement gaps. That's how we, and the reason why I'm so captivated by effective school systems having a liberal arts curriculum, even if it's delivered through different thought lenses or worldviews, if you will, that rich knowledge building curriculum is going to be viewpoint exposing. So just a couple of contrasts, a couple of examples. Most countries of Europe require comparative religion and ethics every year. Now, most of their countries will fund Jewish schools, Catholic schools, secular schools, but everyone in those schools has to learn what Hindus believe, what Buddhism teaches, as part of being a good citizen. It's completely flipped here, where, in any school, parents don't want their kids to be exposed to learning about another religion. Here's another example. The Netherlands funds creationist schools, but every child in a creationist school has to demonstrate competent knowledge of evolutionary theory. So that's the kind of approach that really makes sense to me. It makes sense of the research about knowledge building curricula. It makes sense of the research about strong school cultures. It brings them together. That is a far cry from what we have in this country. So on the one hand, we have traditionalists who think that only the state can deliver effective public education. On the other hand, you have libertarians who don't want to talk about the curriculum and quality, and who are who see school choice as a protective measure to insulate kids against viewpoints. I would say lean into viewpoint diversity in the structure and also in the content of education. Sorry, that was a very long answer.
No, it's good. So to that point, we are now faced with the reality that Donald Trump has won re-election and that the Republican Party has, at minimum, control of the United States Senate and may be on the verge of taking control of the entirety of the government and also having control of the United States House of Representatives. This is the party who has pronounced rhetoric of anti-DEI, of anti-equity and conversations
and
around
social
this,
and emotional learning and all that
social
stuff.
emotional learning and all of these pieces, and at the same time has been an open threat toward women's bodily autonomy, the trans and non-binary community, and even a threat internally at the level of SCOTUS of threatening the Obergefell ruling from 2015 that gave marriage equality. Our college campuses and our education settings, K through 12, are at the center point of this, mostly, in my opinion, because they have always been the first and last battleground. We have seen this throughout history on social issues. Leaning into viewpoint neutrality from your angle, if you were to be able to help guide both minority Democrats and majority Republicans moving forward in conversations from a bipartisan perspective, do you think you can bring people to the table around viewpoint neutrality? And if not, what is the situation we are now faced with in education settings over these next 2 years at minimum?
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, this is a really big question. I think viewpoint neutrality is really, really difficult for me intellectually because I don't think any human institution can be truly viewpoint neutral. I think viewpoint diversity is probably more important, and I would say that goes for, viewpoint diversity within institutions is really important. So, I'll just start with the K-12 space. Viewpoint neutrality doesn't bode well. Let me rephrase that. Viewpoint neutrality in school settings ends up in the research, at least, like on the character education and all these things. If you just say we're not going to answer the why questions, or we're not going to talk about the why questions, we're not going to talk about the various ways of answering these questions that really mean something, it reduces the classroom to an anodyne context. And what that does is it teaches kids that you can't talk about difficult things and unwittingly defaults to the consumer culture that's writ large in the United States, I think. It turns out to be pure utilitarianism. Why shouldn't you cheat on a test? Well, if you get caught, you won't go to college. I mean, there's no way to answer those deeper questions if you're unwilling to engage in viewpoint diversity in some fashion. So in the K-12 space, is there hope for bipartisanship? I do absolutely at the state level see real possibility for bipartisanship. I think there are certain areas in K-12 policy where left and right can come together. And one of those is giving teachers a knowledge-rich curriculum. I have not met a teacher who didn't want to have better materials at the ready. I've never met a teacher in any school sector, public, charter, who didn't want an administrator to have their backs when they had, engaged in conversations that were difficult in the classroom. Those are things we can try for. And I can say in off the record conversations with state leaders, I've seen a lot of bipartisanship around some of those issues. I think the challenges from in the policy world of K-12 education policy, the challenge is how do you get policies like education savings accounts, which are basically giving funds to parents, how do you create guardrails around academic quality? That's what I worry about. I worry about the guardrails around academic quality. One thing I will say about Republican Party capture of all the branches of government at the federal level, the Constitution does constrain the federal government. Most of the education money is in the states. And, the title funds only affect a small, they're powerful. But I do not think that Congress can override laws like Maryland's, which says our voucher program money cannot go to schools that discriminate against LGBTQ. I don't think it would hold up in court. I think that is in Maryland's control. The same thing in Maine. Maine has the same law. These laws, I don't think they could be overturned by a federal force. I just don't see it. So there's still a tremendous amount of power in the states.
So it sounds like in some ways with the potential of pivoting actions for administrators and scholars and educators and practitioners alike is to potentially move and pivot for a while into focusing on the locality. And if the guardrails were to come off at the federal level, to establish guardrails and better models at local and state levels.
State levels, yes, for sure.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask one more question. Going back a little bit, you talked about this difference between viewpoint neutrality and saying that viewpoint neutrality may not ultimately go well and may not actually be sellable because it lacks the sort of rich curriculum and the expectation of people to be able, of students to be able to understand all of this. And it sort of reduces to utilitarianism versus the viewpoint diversity. And coming back to that idea of pluralism for a second, we had a conversation about this a few weeks ago about the idea that pluralism is not syncretism, and that so often we have fallen into the belief that pluralism or the expectation of what we are supposed to be looking for is this neutral, like we don't have hard conversations. One, because potentially we argue that people aren't ready for it, and two, it's divisive to the system and to the individual. And so what it can do is it can spur the institution to appear to be in a mode of panic or a mode of discourse that is just divisive to its own sort of harmony. So
that's a really good point. I totally agree with you. That is really a good point. And I think at a certain point, the insistence, the syncretism, it comes from a place that is actually deeply disrespectful of difference. I mean, imagine saying, from that syncretistic perspective, well, Buddhism and Judaism are really the same thing, if you just think about it the right way. That's an incredibly condescending kind of perspective that doesn't honor the difference. It doesn't honor the deep difference. Now, in a democracy, you want to be able, and this is why having schools that reflect the diverse viewpoints, again, not just about religion and philosophy, but about pedagogy and all of these things is really important. Any parent of more than one child knows that sometimes two children from the same family need different kinds of school environments. But at the same time, insisting on knowledge building about all different kinds of beliefs, all different kinds of historical experiences, cultural experiences, and so forth, is so important to build, if it's done well, to build that respect for people who are different, who see the world very differently. Now there's always going to be a limit. I mean, in a democracy, there should be limits on what the state is willing to fund. We cannot legally, and we should not morally fund racist institutions. It's illegal. Even when there's no money from the state involved, it is illegal to be racially discriminatory and the making of even private contracts. So we're a long way from where we need to be, but that's a pretty hard line. That's pretty fast in law. I am among those who would like to see the same rights extended to all different sexual orientations and gender identities, but we're not there yet at the national. We haven't had that kind of transformation. We have at the state level.
Yeah. So there's a lot. So now
there's a lot of work. There's a lot of work. And I would say I have so much hope in the organizations that are out there, like Braver Angels, trying to create the conditions for coming together across difference. My colleague Hari Hahn, who is at the SNF Agora Foundation, just came out with a book called Undivided about how some churches in the Midwest actually were able to combat the forces of polarization in their community. I mean, there are dozens and dozens. If you look at, there's a group called the New Pluralists that's funding local attempts to build community against polarization. There's an organization that brings together rural Republicans who own shooting ranges with, B'nai Jeshurun, the synagogue, very left-leaning synagogue in New York City, to understand each other. I am so hopeful. I hope these things can be funded and accelerated because we need them so desperately. But I will say, wherever we are, in whatever field we work, we need that. We have to participate in that. And that's what I'm hoping for all the school systems that we work with, that they'll lean in.
I love that. And that is a perfect way to sort of end that, the sort of need for us to lean in further. And so, Ashley, I'm really thankful for you joining us on this conversation. I know we're in the middle of it, all of us trying to respond to this and sort of keep breathing. And I'm just thankful for you being on this show. I hope folks check out the work that is being done at the Institute for Educational Policy, and also check out her new book, Educational Pluralism and American Democracy: How to Handle Indoctrination, Promote Exposure, and Rebuild America's Schools. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. It's a joy and an honor.
This Pulse Check mini-series has been brought to you by Element 451, the next generation AI student engagement platform helping institutions create meaningful and personalized interactions with students. Learn more at element451.com.